Boker Tov.
Okay, Boker Tov, everyone. So we're Masechet Beit Tzadaf Yud Bet Amud Bet. We saw the Mishnah. We finished the initial discussion on the Mishnah last week. To do a quick recap because it's going to come up again. But we saw there is essentially the topic of the Mishnah was related to Trumot and Maasrot, not necessarily. Today we're going to talk a lot about Trumot and Maasrot, but we spoke about Matnot Kuna as well. And the question Chala and Matanot, and the question was whether you could take these things to the Kohen on Yom Tov or not. We saw machloket about that between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. All of this is essentially predicated on the discussion where you have Trumot, Masrot, Matnot Kuna, etc. Things which we have to separate, from the food, the crops, the grain, etc., in order to give to the Kohen or to give to Tzedakah, whatever it is. And the principle is that Chazal said, again, separating any of these things, if it's forbidden, would be an Isur Rabbanan. And Chazal said that any time where, since Yom Tov is inherently different to Shabbat, because on Yom Tov you can cook, you can knead your dough, you can cook, etc. And therefore, any time where I'm going to need to prepare it on Yom Tov, and I wasn't able to prepare the food beforehand, and therefore I couldn't separate the challah, for example, therefore separating challah on Yom Tov is going to be fine. It's going to be fine. The question is, once I've separated it, can I then take it to the Kohen? That was the machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, and we saw three different opinions, right? Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Achirim Omrim, right? Three different opinions as to what that machloket relates to. But we did see, according to everybody, there seems to be an intrinsic difference between the idea of challah and matanot, because challah, you could knead the dough on Yom Tov, so you couldn't separate challah beforehand. Matanot, you shechted the animal on Yom Tov, so you couldn't separate the matanot beforehand. And then truma, the assumption is you can always separate truma on Erev Yom Tov, on Erev Shabbat. Why? Because truma is related to, didn't really go into it, but when would the crops become obligated in truma? From the time of Gemar Melacha. Gemar Melacha means when the food is essentially when it's been harvested and the process of harvesting has been completed. And for each food has its own definition of what that is. When it comes to grain, it's what's called miruach hakri, when the grains are put together in bundles. Right, that's the and those bundles are smoothed out. From that point onwards, that is when it is chayav in truma. Now, and since the Gemar Melacha, generally speaking, is going to be a Melacha which is forbidden to do on Yom Tov, we're always going to assume that the Truma can be separated before Yom Tov. Now, we'll just say that the Gemar Melacha is when the Chiyuv of Trumot and Masrot kicks in on a Doraita level, on a Drabanan level. On a Doraita level, before the Gemar Melacha has taken place, one is not yet required to separate Trumot and Masrot, which means if somebody's going to go, now Midrabanan you still have to, but only if it's for Achilat Keva. If it's called Achilat Arai, somebody wants to go, somebody's very hungry and wants to just take a grain of wheat from the field before it's been brought in for harvesting, there one would actually not yet be required to separate Trumot and Masrot, because you're eating it in a sort of an unusual way before the harvesting process has been completed. So that's just a bit of background. We're going to discuss today in the Gemara, are there situations where essentially the Mishnah's distinction over here, if you look at the last line of the Mishnah, it said, Lo mamartim b'truma she'eno zakai baramata, tomru b'matanot she'zakai baramatan. Right? That essentially we can't compare truma to the others because truma you are eno zakai baramata. You cannot separate truma on Yom Tov. And that's where all the distinction is based on. We're going to see in the Gemara today, is that true? Is that necessarily the case across the board? There is no place where you can separate Truma and Yom Tov. That's going to be our topic today. So let's pick it up. We're on the two dots. We're about, 13, 14 lines from the bottom. So it says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Mashmu, Alacha, Rabbi Yossi. Okay, we just saw there was a three-way machloket in the Gemara, as to what exactly the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is. What are Beit Shammai stringent about that Beit Hillel are lenient about? Rabbi Yossi had a little bit of a different approach. Rabbi Yossi said the machloket is only about truma, if you remember. That when it comes to that can you take the truma which has been separated to the kohen or not? Beit Hillel says yes. Beit Shammai says no. According to the other views, even truma you couldn't take, according to Beit Hillel. But that is Rabbi Yossi, and that is the most lenient view in that sense. And Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel says we paskin like Rabbi Yossi, like Rabbi Yossi. Rav Tuvi Breid Rav Nechemia. Now we have a story. So Rav Tuvi Breid Rav Nechemia Havale Garba de Chamra de Truma. He had a barrel of wine which was truma. Atzal Kamed Rav Yosef. So he came to Rav Yosef on Yom Tov. He said, I have this truma, which has been separated, right? Can I go now? Can I take it to the Kohen on Yom Tov? He said, we said, halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Yes, you can. That would therefore be mutar. Right, Rashi says, "Halachak Rabbi Yossi, v'aliba de Beit Hillel, dafilu truma nami mutar lo lech." That is Rabbi Yossi, according to Beit Hillel, says even truma can be taken. Okay. So carrying on. Now we say like this: Ushpizichne the Rabba Barav Chanan. Havale Asulyata de Chaldala. So the Ushpizichne, I guess the landlord or the place where he was staying, the owner of that residence, of Rabba Barav Chanan. So he had Asuryata de Chaldala. He had mustard stalks on. Again, it's on Yom Tov. Asulyata, says Rashi, chavilot shel chaldal b'shalvitin. These bundles of mustard seeds, which are in their stalks, in their pods, whatever it is, v'azera betochan, and the seeds are inside. Okay, so again, we know whenever we have stalks of wheat which have to be separated, or you have seeds of mustard or whatever else, kitniot inside pods, separating those on Shabbat certainly is going to be an isur malacha. It's going to be it's going to be the melacha of dash, of threshing, when you're removing the inner that food away from the chaff. So the question is as follows: the question is, are you allowed to now take these seeds, to crush them up, and therefore to eat from within it on Yom Tov? So what is the side to say yes, and what is the side to say no? We'll see that it's a good question, because he asked Rav Hanan's question, and the Gemara says, Lo Avabiyadei, he didn't know the answer. Seemingly it's a good question. It says Rashi, Maulifluche, says Shalvitin, to crush these the pods or the stalks, or Yom Tov, to take out the seeds on Yom Tov. Mishale, do we allow it? Mishale be Yom Tov. Do we allow it on Yom Tov? Keshchita ukabishul. Do we say you want to eat it? This is like food preparation. The same way that you can perform shchita, the same way that you can cook. Nobody would question that. Or Dilma, or maybe do we say no? Kevan de efshal me'elav Yom Tov. Lo, maybe because this could have been done before Yom Tov. So we'd say no. The toledet disha. Okay, this is a tolada. This is a derivative of the malacha of disha, of threshing. Okay, so I just want to, for a moment, he said there, kevan de efshal erev Yom Tov. So this is an interesting point that comes up. Let me just see if I can put it on the screen for you. Because the assumption here was, again, there are certain melachot, which we say are going to be allowed on Yom Tov because they are ochel nefesh, but certain melachot, even though they are ochel nefesh, are still not allowed. So the distinction here that Rashi made was that you could have done it. You could have done it before Yom Tov. So the question is, just get it for you. The question is that which you can do before Yom Tov, you wouldn't be allowed to do. So he said the melachot which are allowed are shchita and bishul. So ask a question. And nowadays, right, bishul, cooking is still allowed on Yom Tov. Nobody will say you can't cook the food before Yom Tov. Most of our food we do cook before Yom Tov, and then we put it in the fridge or the freezer or whatever it is. So does that mean that nowadays, that since I could cook it beforehand, I'm not allowed to cook it on Yom Tov? That is the question. Have a look here at the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says, this is in Siman Taf Tzadi Hey, which is the beginning of Ilchot Yom Tov. talks about which malachot are allowed and not allowed on Yom Tov. So just for examples, he says bet for a moment. And we've discussed this a few times. Part of the difficulty of learning Hilchot Yom Tov, again, you have to learn the whole of Masechet Beitza, and then probably learn it a few more times before you start to understand anything, because it doesn't give us the principles of which malachot are allowed, which are not. We just have certain examples, like we see here, and we need to extract from that the principles. And the Rishonim have different opinions. So Seif Bet in the Shulchan Aruch says, K'tzirat, China, B'tzira, Schita, V'tzeda, right? Harvesting, crushing, squeezing, trapping, all of these. These are all malachot which are related to food preparation. Nonetheless, Chachamim say they're asur. You can't do them on Yom Tov. Okay. Have a look at Sif Aleph. So he says, Kol melacha asura b'Shabbat, asura b'Yom Tov, chutz v'mlechet ochel nefesh. Says Shulchan Aruch, any melacha that you cannot do on Shabbat, you cannot do on Yom Tov, except for ochel nefesh, v'chutz mi'otza'a v'hav'ara. Okay, those are another two exceptions as well. We've already discussed in Hotza'ah, we've discussed at length. Carrying and lighting a fire, those are a separate category, but generally it's melech ochel nefesh. Okay, v'chem achsheh ochel nefesh shelo haya efshar lasotam etmol, things which you could not do, things which you could not do yesterday. So it adds in the Ramah here. It says yesh machmirim afilu ba'ochel nefesh atzmo. There are those who hold, and again, this seems to be the opinion of Rashi over here, what we've just seen. There are those that hold that even with Ochel Nefesh itself, Kol she'eino mafig tam klal, im asa'o me'elev Yom Tov, that if the taste is not going to be blemished at all, if you had done it from Erev Yom Tov, then to do it on Yom Tov would still be forbidden. So that's the clue. That's what we say nowadays. The Ramah adds in here the word says Kol she'eino mafig tam klal. Meaning you could have done it before Yom Tov. You could have cooked before, but everybody knows that freshly cooked food is much better than food that's been taken out of the freezer and that's been heated up again. And therefore, that would still be allowed. That is what the heter of cooking nowadays is going to be based on. The Gemara talks about the certain foods which take a long time to cook, and actually which are going to be better if they were not freshly cooked. And those it would be forbidden to make on Yom Tov for that reason. So let's see, the Mishnah Berurah I think gives the examples. Yeah, let's just maybe look at the Mishnah Berurah over there, and then we'll go back into the Gemara. So he says like this. This is Kol she'eino mafig. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Delisha v'aviyah u'shchita u'bishul. Right, kneading, baking, shchita, cooking, imasa'an be'erev Yom Tov, if you would perform, now, in theory, all these malachot you could have performed before Yom Tov, but nonetheless, yesh b'hem chesron ta'am, it's not going to be as tasty. She'en lechem shenilosh v'nafeh hayom kelechem shenilosh v'nafeh me'etmol. Right, freshly baked bread is not the same as bread that was baked yesterday. V'lo tavshil shenitpashel hayom ketavshil shenitpashel me'etmol. Food which is freshly cooked is not going to be the same as food that was cooked yesterday. V'lo basar shenishchat hayom kebasar shenishchat me'etmol. Okay, as I said, the shchita, that's not so ma'asit nowadays, but nonetheless, it's lahachi lo gazru b'hem. Aval davar she'en bo kilkul ta'am ve'hefsed im na'aseh me'etmol. Right, something which is not going to be any worse tasting if it's made, if it was done previously. Who says you can do it on Yom Tov? And therefore, כתבו האחרונים דנקטינן למעשה כסברה זו, וכתבו עוד, לפי דעה זו, אסור לעלוש ביום טוב, whatever that is, שקוראים לוקשן, says that you could not cook on Yom, that you could not make on Yom Tov, שאפשר נילושים מבעוד יום טובים ביותר, וכן אסור לבשל פירות יבשים ביום טוב. He says also dried fruits and things which are, if you make them on Yom Tov, they're not going to be as good as if you'd made them before, and therefore that would not be allowed. All according to this svara. He does that at the end. He says, "Miu im lo haya lo shut mikodem levashel, v'kol sheken she'lo haya lo perot mikodem, v'adai mutar levashlam b'Yom Tov." He says, if a person didn't have time before, or you were unable, you didn't have the fruits before Yom Tov, then you could make them on Yom Tov, because that still fits into the category of something that you couldn't have done. You couldn't have done it before, you can do it on Yom Tov. Okay, so going back into our Gemara, So that's what Rashi is explaining. That those are the two sides of the question here. Where we said we want to know, can you crush up these stalks of these mustard seeds to eat it? On the one hand, it's food preparation. On the other hand, it's part of the malacha of dash, and it's not something you could have done beforehand. You could have done it before. So said the Gemara, "Ma'u lifruche umechal minayu b'yom tov." It says lo hava b'yadei. Didn't have the answer. Rabba Barav Chanan. So atalakame de Rava. So they came to Rava, and Rava says the following. We're now, I think, 8 lines from the bottom. Atalakame de Rava amale molelin melilot umefalchin kitniot b'yom tov. So Rava says this would be permitted. What would be permitted? Molelin melilot umefalchin kitniot. Molelin melilot is essentially you have stalks, and you would sort of crush them again. You crush them in your hand. You rub them together with your hands to soften them and get the stalks out, or get out that which you want to eat. Also mefarchim kitniot, the same thing. You have the pods which you would crush up in your hand to get the seeds out. Rava says that is permitted on Yom Tov. Rashi, in the first of the wide lines, says molalin melilot the dash kilachal yadu. Right, this is threshing. The normal way of threshing, you do it with tools, etc., to crush it up with your hands. That is not the ordinary way. That is with a shinoi. That is kilachal yad. Ve'afilu b'Shabbat lav doraito. Even on Shabbat, this would not be an isur doraita. Ela midrabanan. It's midrabanan. But Yom Tov lo gazor, and on Yom Tov there was no gzera. Okay, so again, it sounds like from Rashi, the fact that it's dash, why is it allowed? Yeah, he says it's allowed because it's an isur dorabanan, because you're doing it in an unusual manner. And Rabbanan did not make this gzera on Yom Tov because it's to do with ochel nefesh. But what we see from that is that if it was done in the ordinary way of dash would still be forbidden. Now, dash is one of the malachot that's related to, I think this is part of the food preparation, but we're still saying that it's forbidden to do on Yom Tov from the Torah. So in a moment, we'll come back to that. Let's just finish up Rashi over here. Melilot. What are melilot shalchitin? Shemola biyadav she'en alakin. Okay, these are these stalks of wheat which you crush up in your hands when they are soft. Now, Abaye disagrees. That was Rava. So Itvei Abaye. Abaye says, "Hamolel melilot me'erev Shabbat lemachal, menapeach miyad liyad ve'ochel, v'lo b'kanon v'lo b'tamchoi." Okay, so there's 2 stages here. There's Hamolel melilot. Abaye says, if you're crushing up these stalks on erev Shabbat, you can certainly do it on erev Shabbat. Lemachar, the following day on Shabbat, he says menapeach miyad liyad. What is menapeach? So the first stage is to soften it. I guess you're separating the seeds or the stalks from the outer shell, but then you want to take them away. So in the melachot of Shabbat, we have a melacha of dash, we have the melacha of zoreh, we have the melacha of borer, of sorting, sifting. These all follow along. So you could blow them to get the seeds out, or move them from one hand to the other to essentially separate the seeds. So again, based on the way that he's doing it, it's an unusual way. Abaye says, if you're doing it in your hand, you can eat. Kanon and tamchoi are different types of implements which are going to be used for sorting. Kanon is sort of like a funnel. A tamchoi is sort of like a big plate which you'd use to separate these things. Says Abaye, you cannot use those on Shabbat. But then he continues, "Hamolel melilot me'erev Yom Tov, lemachar menapeach al yad al yad, v'ochel afilu b'kanon v'afilu b'tamchoi." Says Abaye, if you would crush these things on erev Yom Tov, molel melilot, then on Yom Tov itself you can separate them, right? Even you can use the kanon and the tamchoi. However, you cannot use avalo b'tavla v'lo b'napa v'lo b'kvola. Okay, these are other sorts of. These are much bigger implements, sort of used for separating. So Rashi says, he says al yad, ma'at, separate a little bit at a time. Avalo b'tavla is demichze command avid l'tzorech machar, because that looks like you're doing it for the next day. She'en derech la'asot b'kelim alalu ela halbei. The way of these kelim, you'd only use for a lot. They're much greater quantities, and separating in much greater quantities, that looks like it's not just for the food you need for Yom Tov, that's just you're doing much more. But what's the challenge? Right, Abaye said, he says, Erev Shabbat, and Amalei Melilot me'elev Yom Tov. So it sounds like Abaye is saying that in order to crush them up on Yom Tov would not be allowed. It says me'elev, 3 lines from the bottom. Now it says me'elev Yom Tov in, but Yom Tov lo. On Erev Yom Tov you could do it. On Yom Tov itself you could not. So that was the challenge of Abaye towards Rava's answer. Again, we're trying to answer the question: is this molel melilot, crushing up these pods to get the seeds? Is that allowed on Yom Tov at all or not? So says the Gemara, no, not necessarily. It says afilu tema b'Yom Tov. Maybe even according to Abaye, it would be permitted on Yom Tov itself. So why did it say Erev Yom Tov? V'aidi datana leisha melev Shabbat. Tana Seifa Namim Elev Yom Tov. Right, Abaye was teaching us about the difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov in terms of which tools you can use when you're coming to separate it. So therefore, he spoke about the Reisha had to say Erev Shabbat, and therefore the Seifa says Erev Yom Tov. But Ein Achinami, you would still be allowed to. You would still be allowed to do it on Yom Tov itself. Okay, now all of this is an introduction, again, to get back to challenge the assumption we raised in our Mishnah, that there is no situation of separating Truma on Yom Tov. Based on what we've just said, Hamolel Melilot, we're going to see that's going to raise that question. But just before we carry on, maybe we'll get to that tomorrow, I just want to go back to this, because what we see from here, we see very clearly, at least according to Rashi, we've seen a couple of distinctions in terms of when the malacha is going to be allowed on Yom Tov and when it's not going to be allowed on Yom Tov. And again, we're dealing with Ochel Nefesh. Right? Everybody agrees there are certain malachot of Ochel Nefesh which you cannot do on Yom Tov. And Rashi said over here, this is Disha, Dash, which is threshing. We would think that melacha d'oraita, even for Ochel Nefesh, cannot be performed on Yom Tov. The only reason it's allowed is because it's kelachar yad. Okay, and we saw the distinctions. We saw the fact that something which could be done on Erev Yom Tov, we wouldn't necessarily allow you to do on Yom Tov. We saw also something which is done on Yom Tov, but it's done in great quantities, would also not be allowed. So let me share with you here a sikum from the Pninei Halacha. Again, there are many different opinions here on the Rishonim, so not everybody agrees with this, but I think this gives a good overview in terms of how we know which malachot of Ochel Nefesh are allowed on Yom Tov and which ones are not. So says the Pnei Halacha, this is in the volume on Yom Tov, obviously. He says here, B'Shabbat, kol malacha asura. On Shabbat, we know every malacha is forbidden. As it says, Yom HaShvi Shabbat Hashem Elokecha, lo taseh kol malacha. Vilu b'Yom Tov, מלאכה שנועדה לצורך אכילת אותו היום מותרת. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to perform מלאכה for the sake of food preparation for that day. שנאמר מקרא קודש שלכם, כל מלאכה לא יעשה בהם, אך אשר יאכל לכל נפש הוא לבדו יעשה לכם. Okay, those are the psukim. Now, what you see in the psukim is that it says, at first it says, this is the way the Ramban learns. First it says, Kol melacha lo yaseh bahem, right? Any melacha can't be done, but you can do that with Ochel Nefesh. And then it says, Chenemat, Mikra Kodesh Elachem, Kol melechet avodah lo tasu. So we find a phrase called melechet avodah. So he says, this is the Ramban, and says the Pnei Halacha explaining, Bikfotaf, he says, Rak melechet avodah asura, only that melacha which is defined as melechet avodah, but melacha which is not defined as melechet avodah would be permitted. So what does that mean? It says melacha she'adam ragil lasot beveito dvar yom beyomo letzorach achanat ma'achalav muteret. In other words, that melacha which is considered like a great labor, that you would say maybe the melacha which is done in the field, that's going to be forbidden, even if it's for the sake of food preparation. It's not going to be allowed on Yom Tov. But melacha which is not classed as melechet avodah, that which is the melacha of the bayit, that which you do at home every day. So that part of food preparation is what's going to be allowed. And I think this is a helpful distinction in terms of helping us understand why certain melachot are allowed for Ochel Nefesh and certain are not. So let's read on it a little bit. This is what we saw in the Shulchan Aruch a few minutes ago. He says, Lefichach, therefore, mutar lalush patzek le'efot chalot v'ugot. You can knead dough, you can bake chalot, you can bake cakes, and mutar levashal basar v'dagim. Well, we can cook in the kitchen, meat, fish, perot, yirakot, kol shar machalim. וכן מותר לשחוט בהמות, חיות ועופות לצורך היום. Again, once upon a time, shchita also fit into this category, right? You would, every week or every month or whenever it was, you wanted to have some food, you would do the shchita. Not like nowadays, where the shchita is very, very far removed from the whole process. וכן מותר להגביר את האש או להחלישה לצורך הבישול והאפייה. Okay, adjusting the fire. Okay, lowering the fire is not so simple, but in any event. וכן מותר להוציא מאכלים לצורך סעודה מרשות לרשות, and you can carry the food from one רשות to another. אבל, there's always an אבל. אסור לקצור תבואת השדה. You cannot harvest the grain in the field. לבצור ענבים בכרם, right? Harvesting grapes. לדוש שיבולים, that's our case we're discussing now. Threshing. לזרות את גלגלי תבואה לרוח, to winnow the seeds in the wind. לברוא מהם את הצורות והאבנים, לטחון תבואה, לצוד חיות, עופות ודגים. Right, we said you could shech the animal, you can't trap the animal. לשחוט ענבים ליין, to squeeze grapes for wine, וזיתים לשמן, and olives for oil. Why? All of this is food preparation. But nonetheless, כל מלאכות הללו הן בכלל מלאכת עבודה. These fit into the category of melechet avodah, that this is the avodah, I guess, which you would do in the field or earlier on in the process. That's not immediate food preparation for today, that's done in the kitchen, and therefore, הסימן לכך שמדובר במלאכת עבודה שרגילים לעשותה על ידי פועלים. One distinction may be the מלאכת עבודה, generally speaking, you do by workers, ובבת אחת מכינים כמויות גדולות לימים רבים ולצורך מסחרי. And in one go you prepare for many, many days or for commercial purposes. לעומת זאת, המלאכות שיתרו לצורך אוכל נפש, הם מלאכות שאדם רגיל לעשות בביתו לצורך אותו היום. Those מלאכות, we talk about אוכל נפש, generally speaking, we're talking about things which are, right, at home for the same day, more or less. Okay, so that in broad terms, that is the distinction between those melachot. We say in the order, if you think about the melachot of Siddur HaDapat, the order of the melachot, so all the early ones, plowing, harvesting, etc., those will not be allowed. I think it's the Yerushalmi that says that from lisha va'elach, from kneading and onwards, that is where it's allowed to be performed. So that is why, in terms of our sugya, we're talking about molel melilot, although it is the melacha of dash, it's not so clear and it's not so straightforward that it can be done. And maybe it's only because, as Rashi said, because it's done miyad liyad or kilachar yad, that's the unusual way, and therefore it will only be at the level of Rabbanan, and they allowed that for melechet ochel nefesh. Okay, so we'll see where we're up to is exactly how that connects to the Mishnah we saw before and the distinction about Truma, but that we'll have to wait for tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shkar.
Yeah,
So we'll call tomorrow.